Jeff, good welcome to you this evening. Let me introduce myself. I'm Howard Saxton. I'll be co-hosting this evening with Benji Porter. Nice to have you on board.
Hi, Howard. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Do your family mind that we've dragged you away from your normal life to do one of these?
Yeah, they've been very understanding over the past couple of months, but you'll see I'm outside, so I'm not infringing on their evening.
I thought maybe they booted you out because of the cigarette.
No, no, no. Well, that too, but two things can be true at the same time.
So maybe we always have pre-chat as people join, and we have over 1,000 devices registered already for this evening. So it will give us at least about 2,500 people watching, and certainly over the
Nice.
days ahead on YouTube, many more will watch as well. But this certainly, I mean, tonight we're talking about Babita Deokaran, the book Corruption in South Africa.
Yeah.
But your previous book, the one
Yes.
about Jacob Zuma and the one about the riots in KwaZulu-Natal, in retrospect, a few years later, are there parts that you knew then that you maybe know now?
I think we always, off the record, we
Only,
always,
only,
yeah.
only thousands of people watching us and recorded on multiple platforms. So as off the record as it can get.
No, so I think there was an understanding then that Duduzile Sambutla Zuma had a significant role to play. And it was critical to us to understand how social media was weaponized because people often forget at that time in the middle of COVID, people were glued to their devices, and social media was turned into a faction fight with battle lines drawn along racial divisions. So that was a fact of the matter. And then Duduzile Sambudla Zuma obviously was, a firm protagonist of the support for her father. And again, we can't discount the timing of things. I mean, the reality is the unrest began as Jacob Zuma was imprisoned. So I think it cements a lot for us now. And I think this trial is going to be so important, the one that she's sitting in at the moment in the Durban High Court. I think it's got immense ramifications for our democracy because, the allegation is that she stoked division and fear and basically incited violence that cost hundreds of lives, billions in damage, and people need to be held to account for that. So at the end of this trial, I truly hope that justice is served in her case.
What's happened to all the DJs and other people who were originally arrested?
So what we saw after the unrest was basically an example. So let me take it back a couple of steps. So Becky Cele, you'll remember during the unrest, told us about the 12 instigators, almost like these disciples of anarchy. And that ended up to be something of a pipe dream, like much else that has come from Becky Cele. But the reality is, we saw a wave of arrests of low level instigators. And truth be told, those cases have pretty much fallen off the map. Because I think what South Africans actually want is the real architects of this to be brought to justice. Of course, the lower level players, had a role and they fulfilled that role and they may have fallen foul of the law in doing so. But we really want the people who seeded this. We want the people who set this in motion. And I don't think those people are before court yet. Or maybe one is. We'll see.
So Benji's joined us this evening, and Benji, we're just busy talking about Jeff's previous book, the one to do with the KwaZulu-Natal riots a few years ago. And I asked him if he knows now, or if he knows now things that he wished he knew then when he wrote the book in the first instance, because I think all of those of us who put matters down in print sometimes in retrospect wish we had some additional information. But Jeff, let's talk about how the police behaved. And then we'll get ask Benji to join the conversation. The police were very muted in the beginning. Do you think if
Well,
they had shown a stronger hand in the first hour or two of what we saw, that they could have stopped the rioting and the looting? Do you think ultimately that they showed weakness, probably at the behest of the president, which really gave permission for other people to go in and join the carnage of looting?
I can't say with any level of certainty that any inaction on the part of police was intentional or for political imperative. My assessment of the situation was that the police were essentially cast aside All of the looters, because of the way in which they did it, had stolen a march on police, and within hours they were overwhelmed. And it was quite ingenious the way they did it, because we found anecdotal evidence of several instances, especially in KwaZulu-Natal, not so much here, but just because of the geography of things, especially in KwaZulu-Natal, we would see instances with buckies coming and dropping off tires, setting fires and blockading roads. Then looting would follow. And when the police responded, they would be caught up in that situation. And then that bucky with the tires would then go to a different location and do the same thing and essentially build blockades in the path of the police. Now, that's a that's a that's a strategic direction on behalf of these anarchists or rioters, because there was a level of coordination. So you see that, and you see, well, the police were essentially dismantled by this. Number one, they were overwhelmed in terms of numbers. They weren't well prepared in terms of their resources and training, which is something we already know. And then they face a coordinated enemy, and they are completely brushed aside within hours. And that's why the looting had such a devastating effect, was because law enforcement was completely rendered naked. And it's not only the SAPs, largely the SAPs, but also the metro police in the larger metropolitan municipalities like eThekwini. The police were totally outmatched and outgunned. It speaks to, a paucity of their ability and their training. And it just showed for me, or my take home from that was just how quickly we can topple off the knife edge. We really do live on a precipice, because it was a matter of hours, not days. And the state had completely lost control in nearly two provinces of the nine, and arguably two of the most important provinces. So, that's my read of the situation. Whether or not there was coordination for a political imperative, definitely on the part of Jacob Zuma, that we understand. But whether the police were told to, stand back, let this happen, let maximum damage ensue, that's more difficult to pin down.
Sorry, Benji, I interrupted you as you were coming in earlier.
Hi, Jeff. How you doing?
Good in yourself, Benji. I'm just going to squeeze in one before the
Go for it.
Thanks.
Thanks so much.
Adds into atmosphere. We love kind of the smoky backroom feel.
If you guys aren't offended by it, and you don't think the people watching will be offended by it, then I'm just going to go wild.
You know something? Everyone's a mature adult and makes decisions for themselves. So I honestly don't care.
We hope so.
One of our favorite webinars during COVID, in the middle of a blackout, and we were doing terrorism in Botswana, in Mozambique, and we had to. Oh, do you remember her name, Benji? I'm going to go, but she's sitting in the dark with a torch under her face, because there's no lights on and there's smoke everywhere in the room. And,
sounds like Jasmine Opperman.
Jasmine Opperman. That's exactly who it was.
That is very good, Jeff. You know your trade. I remember that time.
I know my spies.
I remember that time of the riots, and what was so amazing was the level of disinformation and how quickly it spread.
It's massive.
Yeah, those WhatsApps and those, where like kind of, I don't know what your view is on that. That felt just something different too.
Part of the coordination, especially Benji. I mean, did you ever travel to KZN in that time? Because I can tell you, I was in both provinces, and it was a completely different world. I mean, here there was some semblance of normality, but in KZN it was lawless. And especially in Phoenix, how quickly they got the Indian and the Black communities to turn on one another. These are people who lived next door to one another for decades, and instantaneously the roads became the border. And it was remarkable, actually, and has to be part of the way in which it was seeded.
So, do you think this was a brilliant military pre-planned operation? Like, is that, if we go deep, as opposed to kind of people saw an opportunity and just grabbed the opportunity? We saw those pictures of the Mercedes Benzes arriving and people going to loot televisions in the Mercedes. That I presume is spontaneous.
Yeah, but I mean, it's very easy to seed chaos. It's the initial seeding where the culpability lies. So you have a scenario where you know, they're the haves and the have-nots. That's trite. You know, we have a large portion of our society that's desperately impoverished. And when it becomes a free-for-all, it's very easy to weaponize that. And that's what was done to devastating effect, because the crowds essentially became the weapon. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And if we talk about kind of the taxi mafias who all came to the defense of things like the shopping centers and the malls, and like, how do we harness that for good?
So I think in the moment it was harnessed for good, and I think it's just another example of you know how your you know archetypal bad actors can also sometimes be noble. And I mean, I think when you think about the role that the taxi bosses had to play in the unrest, it wasn't insignificant. You know, we had unrest beginning to seed in the Eastern Cape, particularly on the part of Andile Lungisa. He'd fall into rank and file of the Zuma faction. He still is. And we had a scenario in the Eastern Cape where taxi drivers actually loaded him onto the back of a truck with a loudhailer and drove him around town and forced him to tell everyone to remain calm. You know, Belito was largely untouched because the taxi bosses came into the picture. In Vosloorus, we saw it as well. So I think when it comes to their motivation, the obvious conclusion is that it's got to do with money. When the economy shuts down, so does the minibus taxi industry. It's its lifeblood. It relies on 70% of South Africa's population taking taxis and buses to be able to get to work. And when that stops suddenly, so does the cash. So you have some sense of their motivation. So someone I found also very interesting was in Nhlanhla Lux. So in Nhlanhla Lux, some of you may remember, he ended up being the de facto mayor of Soweto. And he was a wonderful heroic figure, the civilian walking around in body armor with a rifle slung across his chest, because that's what we did back then, because there were no police. So, we had these militias springing up all over the place. And he was an interesting figure because he became this sort of media darling. And then he had this massive fall from grace with a xenophobic swing to Operation Dudula, which obviously has more far-reaching ramifications for millions of people who call South Africa home, but are not necessarily citizens. So we have this, wonderful period in our history where, in some cases, people reverse their roles or reverse their archetypes, and the taxi industry is an example of that. And in Nhlanhla Lux, largely is a very specific human example of things.
Jeff, I want to tell you a story because, it always suits our narratives to have good guys and bad guys, but no one's all good and no one's all bad.
I think that's excellent because, sorry to interrupt, it's something I think about often. It's not linear. There's, you think about good and bad as like spaghetti, because people always want to identify a hero and a villain, and it's almost impossible to do that.
Yeah, you've got that desperate need of heroes. Yeah.
But the example that I use is that of Wouter Basson. And, you speak of Wouter Basson and people say, in charge of the chemical weapons program in South Africa, used to throw people out of aeroplanes like poison. He was Dr. Death. And yet I used to run the country's elections. And in 1994, we ran out of indelible ink after the first day of the elections. And the only person that we could turn to make more indelible ink in order to have the second day of the elections just so happened to be Wouter Basson, who galvanized everyone in the entire chemical weapons program. And they made enough chemicals and indelible ink to mark everyone's fingers so democracy could happen in the country. There is no such thing as all good or all bad. We're all, and sometimes we swing between the different sides.
No, I'm with you there. What a fascinating story. I mean, Wouter Basson, and he's still in the news today. I mean, he's still carrying the legacy of the past. I wonder how many people know that story actually.
He carries the legacy of the past, and yet he's a cardiologist still saving lives. We need to understand how often we work within the grey.
Absolutely.
So we're going to go live in approximately 1 minute. We're broadcasting tonight, as usual, on YouTube, on Zoom, and on Facebook as well. We know that a lot of people come back after the actual webinar and they watch, and sometimes we reach tens of thousands of people. Sometimes we've even gotten up to 1 million people who've watched some of our webinars. But we think tonight we have a remarkable story. So the time has just gone 8 p.m. in South Africa, and a big welcome to everyone watching us around the world. We hope very much that last week Sunday that you enjoyed the Jewish Achiever Awards, and that's been watched by over 30,000 people who watched the Jewish Achiever Awards live last week. And a huge congratulations to the 13 people who all walked away with awards. And Jeff, we told amazing stories, people of doing remarkable good. Sivanya Ari, who's provided clean, fresh drinking water to 1 million people in South Africa and 6 million people around the continent. An amazing story and such a privilege to give her an award. Or the organization Kai Lam, the Saxes, the Markmans, the Feldmans, who have given 21,000 title deeds to black families who are deprived of title deeds, and the municipalities wouldn't give them title deeds, and they've gone, and now over 120,000 people have title deeds to their homes because of Kai Lam. Those are some of the awards that we gave us last Sunday. If you haven't watched the awards, go onto YouTube, look at the SA Jewish Report channel, and absolutely watch some of those remarkable winners. It's such a privilege to be able to tell their stories. Tonight, this evening, just before we begin and tell you what's in this week's edition of the Jewish Report, we're doing a broadcast on Wednesday. We don't usually do on a Wednesday, so the newspaper's just gone to bed, and we'll show you the front page in a second. But a huge welcome to Jeff Wicks, one of the most interesting journalists in South Africa, and we're going to start shortly and actually ask him how you become an investigative journalist. We're going to start, but for those people who haven't seen, Gilana is on controls tonight, and a huge welcome to Gilana. Please show us what's on the front cover of this week's Jewish Report. It's just gone to the printers. It will be on the shelves around the country tomorrow, and you'll find it in your local Discount or your supermarket or your spaza shop. But we distribute in about 240 locations around the country, and the front page edition this week is SA Jews Fear Anti-Semitism in the UK NHS. Go pick up a hard copy, as I say, distributed in places like Durban, Cape Town, Port Elizabeth, East London, Bloemfontein, Pretoria, Johannesburg, in about 240 locations, free of charge. Go pick up your hard copy, or if you prefer to rather read it online, don't forget, you can always go onto sajr.co.za. About 280,000 people read our editions online last month. So it's nice to see the huge following we have in places like the United States, Canada, Australia, England, Israel, all over the place. People are coming back to read the stories of our community. So please go do that. As well as the question that we asked during every webinar, can I see the past editions of the webinar? Go onto the website, click on webinars. That's the easiest way to do it. Or alternatively, on YouTube, go to the SAJR channel and you'll be able to see any of the past webinars there. And the last thing we want to tell you before we forget, journalism is really important, and investigative journalism is the most important part of South Africa. We probably would never have exposed so much of the corruption that we've seen without people like Jeff. His latest book, The Shadow State, Why Babita Deokaran Had to Die, that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. But please, guys, go to your local exclusive books or your CNA. Do CNA still exist? I'm not even sure. But go to your bookstore, wherever you do it. Jeff, is it available on Kindle? Is it available on Audible? We want people to actually go read this remarkable story of one of the bravest South Africans who probably never even realized how brave she was until 12 bullets pierced her body. Tell us where we can get a copy of this book.
Thank you, Howard. Yes, as you said, at any decent bookshop, exclusive books or bargain books, it's also available on Takealot at quite a discounted price, also on Audible and Kindle. So there's the full array if people want to acknowledge Babita Deokaran's sacrifice and her story.
Her story, but most importantly, let's not forget the brave journalists who actually go out at great risk, great personal risk to themselves, and actually allow us to read stories like this and to really lift the lid of some of the horrendous corruption that we see within our society. So thank you very much, Gilana. You can take that down now, and a big welcome to everyone who's joined us around the world. Please remember as well, if you're watching us on YouTube, go click that like and subscribe button. That just allows us to easily communicate with you. But Benji, last week I was in the game reserve and you called me and said, I think we need to do a webinar with Jeff Wicks. Tell us why.
Firstly, Howie, I just want to add that if you haven't watched the Jewish Report, the Achievers Dinner, at least watch Howie's speech. It was remarkable. And go and do yourselves a favor, just listen to that speech. So, Howie, we've been hearing these names. We hear things like Cat, and we hear things like Vusi, and we hear Babita's name. And all of it feels so distant and far apart. And then we hear Sibaya as a policeman and Masamola, and we can't put all of it together, and it feels like different stories happening all the time and not so interesting. And then on the 6th of July, 2025, in military garb is a senior ranking policeman, a general from KwaZulu-Natal, Makwenazi, surrounded by a number of his force, for want of a better word, and all in military garb, and some of them with balaclavas on, with automatic machine guns, and he calls a police conference, a media conference, and he begins to announce widespread corruption and just criminal activity within the police. And that got everyone, I think, a bit shocked. And now we've got things like the Madlanga Commission and a special commission in Parliament. And so I really did think we needed to inform our viewers, inform our community. And I asked around, and there was only one name that came up. And that name was Jeff. Jeff was very open to coming on and discussing it. And Jeff has got an outstanding bio, award-winning journalist, he's written 2 books, and very well respected. But what is actually more in Jeff's credit is how his fellow colleagues speak about him, in terms of that we have the perfect person to speak about this issue. So I think that context of a high-ranking police officer announcing something to the state in military garb is something that we have to explore, and we hope tonight to explore it more.
So, Jeff, tonight you're going to join all the dots for us, hopefully, so we can actually draw a much bigger picture.
And I'm going to do my best, Howard. Let me insert a rider early on to say this is a complex web of actors and machinations, but let's try to decode it. I will certainly offer you my best.
So I want to start with something personal, because before we begin, I want to understand who Jeff Wicks is. For those of us with Jewish mothers, the first thing they would say to us: "You're putting yourself in danger. Don't do this." You've got a wife, you've got kids. What do they think of your job, and how did you become an investigative journalist?
So I'm very lucky to be married to a journalist as well. My wife is Babita Wicks. She does court and legals reporting for News 24, and that's it's handy to have a strong woman behind you, because writing Babita Deokaran's story and walking this path as an investigative journalist is not always easy, and it's often a very lonely pursuit. So I'm very lucky to have her, because of all the danger that I've courted in trying to tell the story of Babita Deokaran and everything she found at Tembisa Hospital. I had her support even when it was hard. And it's the 2 of us and our 2 dogs. And I think, in terms of how I became a journalist, I was like any other teenager finishing school, uncertain of what the future may hold and what my life would look like. And I debated studying law, but I wasn't very book smart. And I had a wonderful history teacher who encouraged me to read a book called The Bang Bang Club by Joao Silva and Greg Marinovich. I mean, it's a famous epitaph of what the high point of violence in apartheid South Africa was. And I read it and I was captivated, and I thought, wow, this is this is action and excitement every single day, and the realities of journalism are somewhat different. But I've now been a journalist for almost 19 years and a member of News 24's investigations team for 5. And I've learned a bit in the near 2 decades of doing this. And in journalism, you will know this is a craft more than an academic study. You learn it while you're doing it. And I studied journalism at the Durban University of Technology. I graduated in 2009, but I've always been a crime reporter. And I always wanted to be an investigative reporter, but it's not something you start out as, and you have to work towards it. It took me 14 years to get there. But I'm happy that I did, because it ultimately comes with a massive responsibility and also a privilege, because the responsibility is that, with South Africa's rich history of watchdog journalism, we have to continue that legacy. We have to hold people in power to account, even when it's difficult or uncomfortable or sometimes even dangerous. And that's our responsibility and also our privilege, because we service democracy in doing so. And it's not only investigative journalists, it's all journalists. People who give a voice to those who otherwise wouldn't have it, and keep people informed. Because every couple of years we toddle off down the road to the school or to the municipal building to go make our mark at the ballot box. And we should do so understanding that we are the best informed South Africans that we can be. We know everything. We know about current affairs and what the current government is subjecting us to in many situations, and we can make informed decisions. And that's our role as the fourth estate. And I'm very lucky to do it. I always say I've the best job in the world. I've never been more stressed in my life, but it's fulfilling. And it's those rare moments in journalism that not many people understand, because people often ask, you write about corruption all the time and nothing ever happens, or if it does happen, it happens 4 years later. It's very rare moments in journalism where you feel like you've actually prompted an outcome or made a change in someone's life. And, the way the Deokaran family has welcomed me in the work that I've been doing, I'm very lucky to have them. I care for them very deeply, and they don't deserve what has happened to them. And it's one of those rare moments in journalism where you feel like I've made a difference. And, if that answers your question in a very wayward manner.
So in fact, there's a holy mission, because you gave an undertaking to the Deokaran family. You weren't going to give up on this if they were willing to entrust you with the story, and that meant getting hold of computers and cell phones and things like that to be able to tell the story. And if you don't mind, I'm going to ask you to tell us the story this evening, because I think there are many people that won't know the name Babita Deokaran. Tell us about her, tell us her story, and what you started to uncover when you started to unravel some of the mystery behind her assassination.
So Babita Deokaran can be bookended quite neatly in 2 ways. There's the person she was at work and the person she was at home. And at work, she was the chief accountant at the Gauteng Health Department. And she was a career civil servant. And she was a single mom, and she'd been in that position for several years. And on Monday, the 23rd of August, 2021, as she was coming back from dropping her daughter at school, she was gunned down. A car pulled up alongside her and just unleashed a salvo of bullets, and she was shot 12 times. She died later in hospital. And that was Babita Deokaran, the civil servant. And that's how we came to know her, because within a couple of hours, we had the press statements from the police and the politicians saying, this Gauteng health official has been murdered. And at that stage, it was just a murder. We didn't know much else. And certainly for me, what I didn't know then was the person that Babita Deokaran was. She came from an extremely tight-knit family that all live so close to one another, and they're so deeply involved in one another's lives. And she deeply doted on her teenage daughter, who, on that day was rendered an orphan. And she came from nothing. Her lineage traces back to the Indian indentured labor. And her father and mother grew up on the sugarcane plantation outside Durban. And she built herself this career through grit and determination. That's the human being she was. And that was essentially the start of our story. That's where our investigation began, because the book is the sum total of nearly 47 stories in an investigative series for News 24. And, we didn't know much about Babita Deokaran. And then I came to know her when I got close to her family. And truly, they had such an immense role to play in us being able to tell the story, because that friendship that you referenced with Rakesh Deokaran, her brother, how that came about was we were obviously trying to investigate this. We were following the court process, but we were desperately trying to answer the why this woman had to die. You know, there was obviously motive behind her death. Nothing was stolen from the car. The car wasn't taken, and she was shot at point blank range. So we understood there was more to her killing and likely intent behind it. And then there were many media houses covering the assassination at the time. And one of those was the Sunday World. And they published a story based on a WhatsApp message that Babita had sent to her boss, Gauteng Health CFO Lerato Maggio, and it's on the back jacket of the book. You know, it became such a crucial piece of evidence for us because several days before she was killed, she sent a message to her boss saying, you know, I'm worried the guys in Tembisa might be onto us if we don't release their payments. You know, our lives might be in danger. So I saw that, and it was just a single message. And it gave me an understanding that there was more on that phone. I desperately wanted the cell phone because, you know, that's just not a single message sent out of the blue. That's part of a conversation. And it'll give us, you know, a real head start in trying to understand who might have had motive to kill this woman. But the problem was I didn't have her cell phone and I didn't have her laptop. I didn't have much of anything. We hit blank walls for months, nearly 7 months before we got access to those devices. And how we got them was that I'd tried to, develop a rapport with Rakesh, but this was a man who was so stricken by grief, he wanted nothing to do with me. So it took me a couple of weeks, but I eventually got him to sit down and I just said, you don't have to say a word. You can just listen to me talk. And I told him what I was about. I said I was serious about my work. We'd done complex investigations before, and chiefly, I believed then, as I do now, that what happened to your sister is a travesty. And I gave him an undertaking then, as you would have read in the book, that I'll follow this thing to the end. And together we managed to extract the laptop and the cell phone from the police, and with that we had all of the evidence. And that was 3.5 years ago, and it's brought us to now. The latest story in our series was published 2 weeks ago. So it's been an odyssey, arguably the most challenging assignment of my career, but simultaneously the most fulfilling.
So you pay 40,000 Rand to break into the computer and the cell phone to read the messages. What do you find?
So when we got access to those devices, what we had on her cell phone was a basic re-sketching of the last month of her life, almost down to the second. And we could plot that together by movement data from the phone, how she was communicating with people who Google searches. But, the most valuable trove for us was the emails, 60,000 Gauteng emails. And we performed the first search in this database because it had keyword search capability. And the first search was obviously Tembisa because we remembered it from the message. And what we found was the report, a 10-page document that likely got Babita Deokaran killed. She filed that report to her boss on the 4th of August. She was killed on the 21st. And in that report, she said, there is possible fraud occurring at Tembisa Hospital. They've spent 850 million Rand in 4 months. Their annual budget is 200 million Rand. And all of these payments were suspiciously priced just beneath the threshold that it would prevent a rigorous tender process. It was done on a 3-quote system. And she condensed her concerns basically into a list of 217 entities. And that was the list that we started with. And, it looks daunting at the beginning, but once you peel back even the first layer of beneficial ownership, the directors of these companies, that list shrinks because you've got one person who controls 12 companies that's all trading with the hospital at the same time. So that's how we started trying to look at the syndicates. And in the end, we identified 3 distinct syndicates, the ones that have been confirmed by the SIU. Them, with their powers of intrusion, obviously went further and they identified 6 other syndicates. And I think that's the most devastating realization of the Tembisa hospital scandal. 2.3 billion Rand, 4 years, and 9 distinct extraction syndicates operating the hospital. And when I say extraction syndicate, I mean paper companies. There's no evidence that any goods were actually delivered. These were orders which were just, Tembisa Hospital became a contract factory. And a small group of men became eye-wateringly wealthy because of it.
So, Jeff, I think you gave the example, they ordered plastic buckets that you could buy at Pick n Pay at like 10,000 Rand a bucket.
Yeah, 9,800 Rand for 4 plastic buckets, 9,800 Rand each, 2 in red and 2 in blue, if you can believe it.
And so she comes across this over 2 billion rand. At that point in time, she probably doesn't know it's anywhere close to the 2 billion rand markets. She's talking in the hundreds of millions of rands mark at that point in time. And they stopped, she stopped paying. Or did the payments stop?
So what she'd done was she filed this report, and she was looking at 4 months and 850 million rands worth of procurement. And, that was a 4-month track that she'd done. And what she'd also did was to halt 100 million rand in outgoing payments, which had already been ring-fenced at a provincial treasury. And she said, we're going to halt these payments and we're going to wait for an urgent forensic investigation. Because I think at that point she was concerned that, this was future irregular, wasteful expenditure, which it turned out it was. So she didn't understand the true scale of things at that stage, but she halted the cash. And within weeks of being killed, that money was released and those payments continued. And those payments continued for a full year afterwards. It was only when the SIU got their proclamation, even after we at News 24 had named them and exposed them. So only after the SIU got their proclamation did the payments cease. So that should tell you a lot about impunity and a patent lack of accountability.
So after the assassination, the hitmen are actually caught. What happens to them? But obviously they're the first layer. They're not the people who actually ordered the hit. But how do they catch the hitmen, and what happens with the trial?
So yes, there were 6 hitmen who were arrested on the 27th of August, just shy on 4 days after the assassination. And it was quite remarkable how they were caught. And it's owing to some really good police work and some really good work on the part of private security companies who helped them. And, it's just another case in point of how the private sector has had to step into the void, but people must get their flowers. And in this case, it was a group of police officers and private security personnel who tracked the cars that were used on the day of the assassination. They were able to set out how, there was actually surveillance of Babita Deokaran for several days before she was killed. And what they did was they used technology that was available to them to log the license plates and then wait and see where these cars would pop up. And within a couple of days of the killing, one of the vehicles popped up in Rosettenville. And what followed was, a police operation that bounced between houses all across the city, 3 safe houses, in fact, in Rosettenville, and arrested these 6 men with, a fair amount of cash and a whole lot of cell phones, but no murder weapon. And what we saw then was the arrest of these men, and then they made admissions. And chief among them was Pakamani Hadebe. He was a gentleman, a taxi boss from KwaZulu-Natal. And he basically started talking and said, Zweli Mkhize, the then health minister, ordered this hit. And, you can imagine the police officers having to hear that their eyes must have nearly bulged out of their skulls, because at that time he was the health minister, and he was arguably the poster child for COVID corruption through the digital vibe scandal. So cops had good leads in the beginning, and the case seemed to fall apart when the Hawks took over. Because when the Hawks took charge of the investigation, taking it away from the Provincial Serious and Violent Crimes Unit, which had previously held it and made the arrests, that's where the progress in the case stopped. There were 2 other arrests after the arrest of these 6. They were inexplicably released, and at the time we couldn't really understand the significance of these 2 men. But as it would turn out, when these hitmen eventually took a plea and sentencing agreement 3 years later, they named one of the men who'd been released from police custody inexplicably as the one who'd given them the orders, and in fact the man who'd pulled the trigger. And that came out years after the assassination in open court. And then it was the police to go find this man, but even if they wanted to, they couldn't. He was dead. He himself was assassinated in December 2021. So that was a loose end neatly tied up. And there were many other missteps in the way the Hawks conducted this investigation. You touched on it earlier. The fact that they had the cell phone and the laptop, we only found out once we got access to it, is that the police had never actually examined those devices. They were seized from Babita Deokaran's family on the day of the killing. And then they sat and gathered dust in an evidence store. They weren't so much as even turned on. So we paid the money. We were able to find out exactly what Babita Deokaran's final investigation is. Arguably, we found the document that likely cost her life. The Hawks, to this day, have not arrested the mastermind behind her killing, and they've arguably been in darkness of their own making, because had they only looked, they would have found what we found. And they have the resources to do so. We don't. We had to pay for it. So, there are many missteps in this Hawks investigation. And it's part of the tragedy of Babita Deokaran's story is that, arresting the hitmen, sentencing them to jail time is not justice. Everyone who understands how targeted assassinations are carried out in our context understands that the hitmen are disposable pawns. They operate in a value chain of proxies and fixers and paymasters, but ultimately the mastermind. And that's the person who still breathes free air and sleeps in his own bed or her bed to this day, while Babita Deokaran's family has to feel that loss. So, the trope of police failure carries through the book. And I think it's something that, is very germane now. It's something that a lot of South Africans experience because we're so often beaten down by crime. It's a daily reality for many of us.
So before I hand over to Benji to continue with the discussion, I want to know, do we draw an inference on the Hawks? Is it incompetence or is it complicity?
Well, I think the net result, Howard, is the same. Whether it's rampant incompetence or complicity and corruption, the net result is the same. People are denied justice. And certainly in Babita Deokaran's case, they were denied justice. Now, I have no direct evidence that the investigating officer, the Hawks captain, now a lieutenant colonel, was promoted after the Babita Deokaran case. I've got no evidence that he's bent or crooked, but I can tell you that he's not smart. On the consensus of the evidence that I found, and I'm no policeman. I'm a mere journalist trying to apply logic, and that was lacking. And you have to ask yourself why. If the tools are available to you, the evidence is sitting in front of you, why have you not used it? At some point, it has to be considered malicious, even if it's malicious stupidity.
I love the words malicious stupidity. But you mentioned that one of the assassins fingers the former Minister of Health. Do you have any idea if the Hawks ever questioned the former minister?
I'm not sure if they questioned him. He was referred to in court at one point as a person of interest. So his name, actually, the Hawks did their best to keep it under wraps, that he'd been named as a person of interest, or at that stage, the paymaster. And we started reporting on it then because, I mean, it's incredibly significant that a member of the ANC's national executive could possibly have ordered an assassination of a health department official. But it never really made sense, and it's never really been backed up by any sort of tangible evidence, because when the hitmen took their plea and sentencing agreement, they disavowed those statements. And I think the prevailing narrative is that was a bit of sleight of hand on the part of these hitmen. Certainly, it would be a dramatic distraction to say to police officers, no, it's a sitting health minister who told us to come here. And then watch them chase that tail whilst the real people behind the murder can just skate off.
So we've heard so many names, and I think one of the things that Benji is going to do is actually take us through some of these names and try to join the dots so we can understand the bigger picture. And some of the information that we have now is because of what General Nkwanazi came out and the Madlanga Commission. We're starting to hear names, and they're recurring names, and some of them we know, and we hear this thing called the Big Five, and we're not quite sure who they are. And I'm going to ask Benji just to take you through, just so we understand the connections between some of these people.
Jeff, thanks for that. And in our culture, we say, may her memory be a blessing to everyone. And so may that be the case. And, these heroes of our country you've brought it to light. Is there anything else that you would like to say about that story about Babita?
I think that I've covered it. I think we can go into the now because, as you said, we've got this cast of characters. Many of them appear in the book. They certainly appear in our national discourse, and I think people want to know what's happening at Madlanga as far as I can try and explain.
Maybe talk me through the Hawks and the personalities within the Hawks. We hear different names, and maybe you can talk me through some of those personalities.
So I think if we talk about the Hawks, not so much in Babita Deokaran's context, but let's talk about it as regards the Madlanga Commission. So I think let me start at the beginning. So the Madlanga Commission, in very broad strokes, is set upon law enforcement's pursuit of two individuals. Vusimuzi Kat Matlala, many people would have heard that name, and then a lesser known individual is Katiso KT Molefe. Now, these are men who, Nhlanhla Mkhwanazi, in his press briefing on the 6th of July, sketched as underworld figures who had immense access to law enforcement, who had political access, and who operated with political imperatives. So those are the two protagonists, really, who set this commission in motion. Well, Mkhwanazi was the one who really galvanized it by going public, but they're the two characters that underpin it. And basically, it regards the attempts by police, and specifically, two individual officers from the Gauteng Organized Crime Unit, aided by members of the Political Killings Task Team, who've been able to really build solid cases against Matlala and Molefe. And prior to law enforcement's pursuit of those two, they'd had many brushes with the law, but none of which that had stuck. So in Matlala's case, he'd, crossed swords with police on 18 different occasions. He was arrested and released with charges withdrawn for a cash and transit heist. He was arrested next to one of Radovan Kretsch's hitmen in a mall in Sandton. KT Molefe was, a drug smuggler who was caught smuggling marijuana and ecstasy in the UK and then deported. So that all lends credence to Mkhwanazi's assertions that these are underworld figures, members of this cartel, who, through state contracts and government money, targeted procurement fraud, had then built this empire, which had also fallen into the world of narcotics, but critically, they had top cops in their back pocket. And if Mkhwanazi is to be believed, they had Senzo Mchunu, the sitting police minister, in their pocket. So it's a story about police capture and how it really brings about what could be the implosion of our criminal justice system from within.
Maybe you can talk about one or two other whistleblowers that were kind of caught up in the story. Armand Swart being one. I mean, there are quite a few. So I don't know where you want to start on that.
Yeah, I think Armand Swart's, his case is the genesis of this. And, it's something that we worked on from April last year. He was an artisan. He worked in a steelworks factory that makes railway components. And he was shot 23 times as he was pulling his car into the gate of where he worked. And what it turned out to be the backstory there was that it was a case of mistaken identity. The intended victim was actually a manager of the firm. And the attack followed closely a whistleblowing report that they'd filed because they had obviously done business with a contractor to Transnet Freight Rail. And they had somehow gotten wind of the fact that their prices were being vastly inflated. There was an order for a consignment of springs no larger than one's finger. And this company, QTech, sold them for R3.20 per unit. And the on-seller, a company called the SK Group, they were selling them for R152 each to Transnet. So it's a nifty way to take a 25,000 Rand contract and make it a 1.2 million Rand one. And that's what they did. And when that...
They said like a spring like this. It was like a tiny...
A tiny spring worth less than 5 Rand. And so that's what Armand Swart died for, because when that illicit revenue stream was compromised, they needed to fix the problem. Unfortunately, they bumbled so badly that they killed the wrong man, but they were also useless enough that they were caught on the same day.
But who was caught? Maybe tell the viewers who was caught.
So there were 3 individuals who were arrested. There was 2, the state in court papers calls them career criminals. Their names are not really important. But the third is Michael Puletau, and he's a veteran detective attached to the Johannesburg Central Police Station, a career cop, basically, who betrayed the badge and was the leader of this alleged hit squad. And arresting them was critical because with them were guns, and those guns have really now told the story that link all the assassinations, because they are the golden thread that connect Vusimuzi Kat Matlala on one side and KT Molefe on the other, because they used the same core group of hitmen who used the same weapons. And so now those guns have been linked through ballistic testing to over 20 murders, some attempted assassinations of the DJs and these personalities that we see. But basically, it allows us to have this now picture of underworld figures, men who are, cartel figures, have gone into state procurement and have access to the uppermost echelons of the police. That's the basis of this. Armand Swart, a man who didn't have to die, his case and the investigation thereof, again, by a good group of police officers and a good group of security personnel who made a real difference. They need to get their plaudits, because without them, this trio of hitmen would still be operating today. We owe them a massive debt of gratitude.
Well, we've linked these hitmen and the guns to multiple different murders. The investigations into them are completely compromised. Is that fair to say? Maybe your call is completely compromised by what levels of the police make it more difficult? And is that similar to the Babita case? Where it's...
So I wouldn't say compromised. I think it was under threat of being compromised. And I think that's where the police capture claims come from. And that's Mkhwanazi's version, to say that, members of this police unit, they face threats from within. There's massive interference, endemic corruption and offers of bribes. And they'd come to him for help, and the PKTT stepped in. So maybe
tell our viewers what the PKTT is and why has that become such a focal point?
So the PKTT is a task team which has been in operation for more than 5 years, the Political Killings Task Team, and it was set up primarily to operate in KwaZulu-Natal because, as we all read the news, we understand that councillors tend to be bumped off. And it was born out of a commission of inquiry, and that was the recommendation to address this issue. It's a task team that's lived and survived longer than its intended lifespan. But in any event, a secondment from that team came and began working on these cases, and once that team was insulated, then they were able to do the work. Prior to that, they were subject to threats, to cajoling, to intimidation and harassment, sometimes from other police officers and high-ranking police officers. And, that's where the commonality, perhaps, with Babita Deokaran comes in, is, this is a delusion of the capability of the state, because the rank and file of cops is so corrupted that they can't actually fulfill their constitutional mandate, because they're either doing nothing or they're taking a backhand to still do nothing. So, that's where the commonalities might be drawn. The import of what we're seeing now is that this is really shaping our democracy. This is, I feel, an inflection point in our society, because all of us know that the police cannot fulfill their mandate. People are victims of crime. They're reaching out for a hero. That's why Mkhwanazi has become such a popular figure. But the reality is it's owing to a state failure, which we've become all too used to. And so if we can bring about meaningful reforms in the way law enforcement operates through this commission, then we've been crying out for that for too long. It wasn't addressed during the Zondo Commission. There simply wasn't time. Now we might see that. So in a way, I'm hopeful, but it's remarkable to me to take a step back and look and see you've got this murder in Vereeniging, by all intents and purposes, it's a blip on anyone's radar. And that singular case is going to influence the path of this entire country.
It's incredible. Can you maybe talk us through, there's a lot of press around a certain wellness contract for the police that who won that contract? What is the backstory around that contract, what you know about it, and maybe some of the detail for our viewers?
Absolutely. So when we started doing the Tembisa Hospital investigation, as I said, we tried to map these syndicates and then profile the people who were part of them. So Vusi Kat Matlala was on our radar because of Babita Deokaran from probably the beginning of 2022. And we placed him in the Maumela syndicate. And we can chat about the Maumela syndicate and what they're about later. But, we had him as part of the syndicate. We started doing background on him. We could see that he had a criminal past. He was also then the owner of a security company. And what brought us to him was that there were 3 shelf companies that he was using to trade at the hospital. Of the 100 million rand that Babita tried to freeze, he was due 5 million of that. So he definitely had many irons in the fire, Tembisa, and we exposed him. We named him. We trawled through his wife's Instagram account, which at that stage was open and very quickly closed thereafter, to show people the Louis Vuitton bags and the helicopter charters and the overseas holidays, money that was paid for by the state and taken away from the people of Tembisa Hospital. And something that came up at the commission today was he had access then to blue lights, through his connections in the Ekurhuleni Metro Police Department. In fact, his security vehicles were registered as EMPD cars, so they could use blue lights and they could skate every fine and roadblock they would ever be confronted by. And we exposed that. And thankfully we did, because now it's formed the basis of the, partly of the Madlanga Commission. And so he was on our radar. He was also publicly named. And what he did was just go and register another company. Its address is in a Boksburg strip mall, been in existence for less than 5 years, and it goes for this 360 million rand health services tender for the SAPS, a 3-year deal to provide occupational health from pre-employment screening to ill health retirement to 180,000 people. It beat out JSE listed insurers. It had only been in existence for 5 years with a lone director, Vusi Muzi Kat Matlala, the same person that we'd written about. So we started up the wheels of investigative journalism again and spooled up another project. And that was, my latest project at News 24, a project called 9 Lives, looking at how he's made his money from the state and all the connections he's developed along the way. So that's the man who infiltrated the SAPS to such an extent that he won what could have been a R500 million tender. Thankfully, now it's cancelled.
So you've got, and we're going to go to Howie now, but so you've got Kat Matlala and you've got KT Molefe, and you've got them winning these contracts. You've got them influencing high levels of the police. And would you be comfortable to talk who that is between Mkhwanazi, his allegations, and who are the people that he's influencing? And then, and then maybe while you're discussing that, is what is the link to Senzo, the Minister of Police, and so maybe that link and some of the backstory on that.
So this brings us neatly to the intersection between the criminal underworld and policing. And this is the source of all the capture allegations that Mkhwanazi set in motion. So, and I'm happy to name names. This is public testimony, and these people will defend themselves. I'm not apportioning guilt. But chief amongst them is Shadrach Sibiya. Now, Shadrach Sibiya, his official title is Deputy National Commissioner of Crime Detection, but it's a really wordy way of saying the country's chief detective. He's an immensely powerful figure who was, aspirant for higher office. He wanted to be the National Commissioner or the head of the Hawks. And he was a person that Mkhwanazi came out and really said, this man's a criminal. And we've heard in testimony since then that many people associated with him have, been found on Kat Matlala's phone, communicating with him. There's no direct evidence that Sibiya and Matlala communicated, but, there is a tangential link. There is credence to the claims that Mkhwanazi has made. And Sibiya, to his credit, has said, this is not true, and he's going to defend himself. And he's pointed to something which is a reality. And what everyone who watches this commission must understand is that the police is deeply riven by factions. And it's been the difficulty for me as an investigative journalist covering the police for the last 5 years is that, it's very difficult to identify a hero and a villain, because there are claims and counterclaims, and this investigation, which is countered by another investigation, and it's a mess. And now what we're seeing is a faction fight which has exploded onto live television through this Madlanga Commission. And, if Mkhwanazi's statements are true in their entirety, it paints a really deep picture about our democracy and, the propensity of the police to be captured and to be wielded as a political implement. And if that is true, it should be devastating for all of us. But we are now in this commission, and, it concerns me, not least, that you've got high-ranking police officers in constant communication with Kat Matlala. There can be no scenario where people say there's we didn't know who this guy was. This man has a persona and a reputation. That's where the name Kat comes from, Cat is likely a derivative of a Sesotho word katsi, which is, township slang for cash and transit robber. Now, where does that come from? And it's a persona that he embraces. He named a security company after it. So Cat definitely has influence, and he's got influence to high-ranking members of the police. It'll be interesting to see if he and Sibiya are as close as some of the testimony so far has suggested. But then Senzo Mchunu is brought into the brawl. And that was unexpected from Mkhwanazi, because faction fighting amongst the uppermost ranks of the police is common. It usually happens in the shadows, but he staged a press conference. And he said not only is, the top ranks of the cops captured, but so is the police minister, and he talks about these evidentiary links between Matlala funding Senzo Mkhunu's political campaign. Now, what we've found in our investigation, partly running parallel with the Madlanga Commission, but we've been looking at this for a while, is that there are certainly links between Kat Matlala and a man named Brown Mokhotsi. Brown Mokhotsi is an interesting figure. To understand him, he is an opportunistic political influence peddler who appears to take money from nearly everyone. So what he did was he was telling Matlala that Matlala would have political cover from Mkhunu if Matlala paid certain bills, including paying 150,000 Rand to send 8 delegates to the ANC's January 8 conference. So I have not been able to find in my investigation, and certainly we've not seen it at the commission so far, is direct communication between Matlala and Mkhunu. That's not to say it didn't happen, because proxies and intermediaries are common. There's no direct evidence so far. But what there is direct evidence of is a tight relationship between Kat Matlala and Bheki Cele. And why is that important? Bheki Cele was the sitting police minister when this 360 million Rand tender was adjudicated and awarded. He resigned a week later. Then, on his version, he strikes up a relationship with Matlala. How convenient. And he accepts lavish penthouse hotel stays from Matlala. He meets with Matlala in one of the chief Tembisa extractors in Bali villa. They were in constant communication, and we have to ask ourselves why. What could the possible motive be for Bheki Cele? And then simultaneously, we must also ask why Mkhwanazi didn't say anything about that in his press conference. That should be clear to all of us, because he came out, and after Senzo Mkhunu, he also could have come out against Bheki Cele. I haven't spoken to him. I'd love to try and get an understanding of the backstory. Maybe it'll happen, maybe it won't. He's gone a bit further in his testimony to say that there was a link with Bheki Cele, but we made sure at News 24 that it couldn't be denied. We made sure that we published it because we understood that it would end up coming up at this commission, because it's important that people understand the truth. And if Kat Matlala has connections to political actors, we must know every single political actor he's connected to, so we can make sure they stay out of politics going forward.
My last question before Howard takes over is, you speak about factions. On the General Sibiya faction, who else would be in that kind of caught in that web?
So, let's use the framing of Mkhwanazi, because this is the only version we've heard so far. So in Mkhwanazi's framing, you've got Sibiya, you've got General Feroz Khan, and Senzo Mkhunu. Basically, there are other smaller actors, but for the sake of brevity and for understanding, let's call that the camp that Mkhwanazi went after. And his press conference and his subsequent testimony is also very valuable, because we were able to place him. And we place him with Khumalo, Dumisani Khumalo, who's the current head of crime intelligence, who shortly before Mkhwanazi's press conference was arrested on fraud and corruption charges. And also Fani Masemola, our amoebic police commissioner, who just seems to exist. And they appear in league with one another. So, I think the battle lines have been drawn. That's patent. And we're about to see where everyone sits as they line up to come and testify.
Yes, that was brilliant.
So I hope it made sense.
Jeff, it certainly made sense, but we keep on hearing this thing, the Big Five. The Big Five criminals that seem to be involved in drug syndication and all sorts of... Do we know who they are?
So there is some understanding of who some of the actors are. According to testimony so far, Kat Matlala and Katie Molefe, certainly members of this Big Five cartel.
Are they two of the Big Five?
Supposedly, you know, as certain we can be about underworld hierarchies, you know, they appear to be part of that network. Then you've got a man called Jabu Mthethwa, and you know, he's interesting because he's also apparently part of the Big Five. I'm not sure if he denies it, but he was at Katie Molefe's house when he was arrested. He was the one who phoned the head of the Hawks, Lieutenant General Godfrey Labia, to say, you know, there's people impersonating police officers at this stress, please come. Now, on Labia's version, the head of the Hawks, who is now retired, he says he received a call from an unknown person and he was worried that people were impersonating police and dispatched the Hawks and a traffic police helicopter. And it nearly ended up in a shootout on the streets of Sandton with this crime intelligence-backed investigation team trying to arrest Katie Molefe and facing off against another group of cops, potentially almost, you know, ensuing into a deadly situation. The other two members of the supposed Big Five are a little bit harder to frame. I can't commit to naming anyone on a public forum, but at some stage, we will certainly do our best to try and name them.
So tell me something. We had a suicide in Paris, or purported suicide in Paris. Natin Tetwa, former minister. Was he pushed or did he jump?
I'm not sure, Howard. I'm not sure. I understand why people, you know, let me not say leap to that conclusion. I understand why they go there. And it's very strange. And I mean, if I can just, you know, maybe verbalize my own computing of the situation, was to say, well, you know, his suicide, alleged suicide, followed shortly after he was named by Mkhwanazi at the Madlanga Commission. So then one could say, well, maybe he was worried about the accountability or the fallout. But there's two problems with that. Firstly, Mkhwanazi's testimony was contextual. You know, he was talking about how Mthethwa had politically interfered when Jacob Zuma was president. He didn't accuse him of a crime. There's nothing unlawful about anything that he did. It's morally bent, but not unlawful. And then, you know, even if it was unlawful, he's an ANC minister. So, you know, traditionally not really fearful of the courts. You know, would you understanding you have political cover, then take your own life because you're worried about it? It doesn't make sense. So, you know, that's what I know. That's how I've tried to make sense of it. And, you know, I'm not sure it carries as much weight as people may think.
The president's nephew from his first wife has suddenly made a dramatic appearance on the scene as well. Huge house in Sandhurst, hundreds of millions of rands. Hlangwani Malmela. Tell us a little about him and how does he fit into the picture?
So Hlangwani Morgan Malmela, Cyril Ramaphosa's nephew from a previous marriage, dating back to several decades, but the link exists. He was the extractor-in-chief of Tembisa Hospital. You know, we identified a large chunk of money that went his way. We pegged that figure at just over 400 million rand. The SIU doubled it. Through 42 companies, some steered by him, others directed by proxies, extracted 820 million rand from Tembisa Hospital in the space of 4 years. He went and bought a property portfolio, 2 villas in Zimbabwe, a house in Camps Bay, a house in Bantry Bay, 2 adjacent houses in Sandton, both worth 85 million rand each. You know, a property in Hartbeespoort, and then this fleet of luxury cars, all in the same color blue. You know, he's everything you envisage about an obnoxious tenderpreneur who takes all of this money and just splashes on the most gaudy possessions you can think of, including these cars. And basically what we tried to do at News 24 and then subsequently the book was follow the money and say, well, this money was intended for Tembisa Hospital. These are the dubious contracts that facilitated its extraction. And this is what the cash was spent on, enabled by car dealers and real estate agents and lawyers and accountants who helped him cover his tracks. And, you know, he's the central node of Tembisa Hospital extraction. All of the other syndicates are eclipsed by him and basically operate in his orbit. And he's famous now because the SIU went knocking on his door to go fetch some of those blue Lamborghinis. And we wrote 2 weeks ago that he'd paid 52 million rand towards a Pagani Huayra Roadster, a car I had to Google. I had no idea it existed, but a single car cost 52 million rand. That's enough to equip 42 ambulances for the community of Tembisa through a single vehicle. So, he is the most notable character to come out of the Tembisa hospital scandal by leagues.
So, Jeff, I want to tell you that I thought I was relatively hardened, but I think you're a hardened journalist. And the thing that shocked me when General Mkhwanazi got up was the fact that these weren't just normal criminals. They weren't just extracting money, but he refers to drug cartels. And the other thing that surprised me or shocked me maybe was he wasn't just talking about police, but he was talking about the corruption of the entire justice system, not just the police, but also prosecutors and judges. Did that shock you? And what do we know about those allegations?
It really did shock me, Howard. I must admit. And, let me make a little confession. When Mkhwanazi started talking, I was several kilometers away from where I'm sitting now, walking my dog. And my phone went ballistic, and I ran home with the dog to turn on the TV. And, it's devastating for South Africa's image to have a high-ranking cop like Mkhwanazi, someone who's lauded widely as a hero, to break rank and to say the system is captured. It's not only the police, it's the politicians, but also the judges and the prosecutors. And evidence around this has been somewhat veiled, and I think veiled for good reason. A lot of this evidence has been laid bare through the in-camera sessions, closed-door sessions of the Madlanga inquiry. So there's very little detail as to which individual prosecutors or judges Mkhwanazi was referring to, but several witnesses have testified to that effect. And again, if those allegations prove true, especially when it comes to the judiciary, I mean, that's devastating. That is such a bloody nose for a judiciary that is so already under threat. I mean, we were talking about the book 8 Days in July earlier. Part of that is sustained attacks on the judiciary. It's part of the playbook we've always seen. We saw it when the Scorpions were disbanded. We had Gwede Mantashe, saying that judges were counter-revolutionary. The first thing you do is attack the judiciary because court rulings are binding and the courts have such power. And, in the same breath, if judges are corrupt, they should be publicly exposed and held to account because they have a higher burden, and I often say we hold our police to a low standard. We must hold our judiciary to the utmost standard. And, to be fair to them, a large proportion of them deliver. That's not to say there's no bad apples in the bunch, but as for who they are, stay tuned, I guess.
So, I want to pick up on something that you were talking about, because why is there such a need amongst politicians for money? It's not just to become rich, but it's turned out that the succession battles within the ANC are enormously expensive. And if we go back to the Nasrec conference that had Cyril Ramaphosa elected, stories abound of people arriving with 340 million rands worth of cash on the one side, and on the other side, similar amounts of cash that had been looted from police intelligence and other government sources. And it becomes a huge festival of bribery, the 6,500, 7,000 people at the ANC elective conference. It may be the greatest wealth creation opportunity for South Africans in the history of South Africa, because literally hundreds and hundreds of millions of rands are given away as both sides try to bribe their way into positions of leadership. So it's not surprising to me that, for example, Senzo Mchunu, who was the president's chosen successor, would have a large need for cash, whether it came from this or somewhere. That doesn't surprise me. Tell me about the things from the Madlanga Commission that you've heard that have shocked you or surprised you along the way.
I think firstly I agree with you, nail on the head. The propensity of ANC delegates to be bought and to buy votes is, it's public record at this point. But I think what has shocked me the most, Howard, is it's not really the individual revelations, but it's the level of detail. And I think that's why this commission is so captivating in many ways, because, you dive into Kat Matlala's cell phone, and that gives you a window to someone's life that you would never otherwise see. I mean, I saw it with Babita Deokaran. It was, surreal in many ways to go through her cell phone. And I think with Kat Matlala, it's no different. And I think what makes it so captivating is you've just got this incredible cast of characters, which are also colorful in their own right. I mean, when you think about someone like Vusi Muzi Kat Matlala, he's like a mafioso almost. You expect to see him with, one of those Dick Tracy fedora hats and a rifle slung across his chest. And I mean, he and others. And I think, it's the descriptive value of this commission to be able to say, look, this is how the machine works. This is how the corruption machine works. It requires the enablement of people within the system. And we see that in WhatsApp messages and, cash payments, these weird cash payments to cops, all after the tender was won. And then it feeds in our want for a hero, especially. And I think that's a role that General Mkhwanazi has fulfilled. And I've been criticized for my public stance on Mkhwanazi, for telling people that be careful of what you wish for. I understand why he's the hero that people want. Trust me, I do. South Africans are so inured to crime that you want someone to take a stance and to take a stand. And my issue, I guess, is not really with Mkhwanazi, but it's the way he's been accepted and developed something of a cult following. And people take a lot of what he says on faith. And that's where, the journalist within me bristles, because we should take nothing ever on faith. You should question everything. And just like, Mkhwanazi is, he's just a man. He's arguably a good man. He galvanized the situation and set in motion this chain of events that may actually result in meaningful change and ridding the ranks of the police of the corrupt. Is he the next police commissioner? I don't know. But I guess my issue comes from the way people just buy what he's saying, when I understand the fractured nature of police leadership, the camps which have been there since time immemorial. And I want a bit more grist, and I'm going to take a step back and not laud him as a hero just yet, and say maybe there are no angels in this story. We've yet to see the ending of it, and that's the nice thing about a commission, is that it's public, and we get to see it, and we get to see exactly how we should position people. So I don't criticize Mkhwanazi lightly, and if I'm wrong about him, I'll eat my hat. But the reality is, I'm skeptical of every top police officer, because I understand the ability of people to be bought. And not to say that he is, but people have that frailty. And I hope, for the sake of South Africa and for the sake of our democracy, is that he can be a hero and that he can galvanize change. I'm just not certain that he is that person yet. But I remain open to have my mind changed.
So, Jeff, this is my great fear. You focused in on a very small segment. You've focused in on Gauteng Health Department. But Gauteng Health Department is a tiny little sliver of the entire country. How big is this corruption thing? Because I'm sure if you go from health onto transport, onto Transnet, onto SAA, onto Eskom, onto oil procurement, onto the road accident fund, like you've dealt with a tiny little fraction, and you found over 2 billion rands worth of corruption and fraud there. How big is this monster?
No. That's something that should cause us immense disquiet, because, I firmly believe that we're yet to see the true scale of the Tembisa thing. I think that cash amount is going to rise. But you've touched on an important topic, and that's why, it's part of the reason why the book is called The Shadow State, because I was trying to find a device to articulate state capture. Because when you talk about state capture, you get this image of Jacob Zuma being bought off by the Guptas. It's very easy to sketch the villains and the heroes in that drama, and they're easily identifiable. What happened at Tembisa Hospital was more insidious because it was unseen, and it was low-value contracts, just executed at scale. And we saw with the Guptas, they targeted SOEs at the top level. They were going for multi-billion rand contracts. How the cash was extracted from Tembisa was via thousands of payments, all under 500,000 rand. And it's insidious because these are records which are never seen. Tender awards and all of the bid documents and all of those things, by law have to be published. Not all state departments do it, but at least there is some sort of, acknowledgement that people in the public are entitled to those documents. These payments, if we did not have Babita Deokaran's laptop, we never would have been able to tell the story. We've been engaged with the Gauteng Department of Health, with lawyers, for nearly 2 years to try to get more documents out of them. They don't want us to see them. And there's a reason for that, because we're going to prove that another hospital was captured. And this happens unseen in our municipalities across the country.
So can I just pick up there, because we've seen fires in some of the hospitals and procurement still seems to happen on paper. Is this an attempt to destroy documents?
I argued that publicly, that the fires set at Tembisa Hospital days apart were an attempt to raise the finance department where all the documents are stored. And I mean, that should shock people too, that in 2025, our procurement system, which, is estimated somewhere at 1.25 trillion rand per annum, is largely done on paper. The Gauteng Health Department procures everything using paper. If you want to win a tender from the SIU, you're going to be submitting a stack of documents. And, we've put people in space. How can it be that we don't have an electronic procurement portal? Because they don't want the guardrails. They want the human frailty of the system, because it allows for further extraction. And without political will, nothing happens. With political will, you can do anything. You've seen it happen before. Why can this not be done? It's because the lines of patronage are too valuable to sever. And paper procurement is a massive issue. And I've argued that if we want to, kneecap corruption, start there. Make it really hard, because right now it's easy. And we've seen the devastating effect. But, the same modus operandi is employed at Eskom. The same modus operandi is employed at City Power. It's all the same. And if we understand how they beat the system, we can make the system bulletproof. And we have to, and I'm just a journalist, Howard. I come and I rant and, I say, well, change the procurement system. But, I'm not here to bring solutions. I tell you where the issues are. And I hope that people who have sway and influence and can affect real change actually go and do it. And I hope that law enforcement will follow up on what we find. And I hope SARS will follow up on what we find. But we just push it out into the ether. I'm very clear about what my role is. And, that's the value of investigative journalism. And that's truly, I'm very lucky to work where I do, because, we are supported by a pool of subscribers. All of this work is a resource loss for us. You know what I mean? There's the good comes from the public good, where we can save the taxpayer 500 million rand and another couple of 100 million rand down the road. But it's for us to just tell you what the issue is, and for other people to go and then follow through and change it. And those people who have to do that is everyone sitting in this forum, because we all vote. We all are active members of society, and we cannot stand for corruption taking over. We all understand we have a small role to play.
So, Jeff, we've got a few more questions for you, if you don't mind, and then I'd love to ask members of the public who are busy watching us on YouTube, Facebook, Zoom tonight, to be able to ask you some questions as well, and submit some of the questions and things they have on their mind. So please remember, this isn't a monologue or a dialogue here. This is really something that involves everyone. So please use the chat feature on Zoom or the chat feature on YouTube or Facebook, and we'll make sure that all of your questions are brought to Jeff this evening. But if I can just go and ask, how hard does it go? I think it was Davy Root yesterday, or one of the other economists, who said for every rand of tax you pay, South Africa only gets 5 cents worth of value. And that can't happen without massive corruption and without the knowledge of the president and without the cabinet. And we hear all of these stories about corruption within the cabinet, and Ramaphosa willing to stay in power by tolerating the corruption in order to make sure that there are no fractures and splits within the ANC. There's a sit back and allow carte blanche to whatever you will. Do you believe that this level of corruption has to be seen on cabinet level and go right to the top?
Absolutely, without doubt. Look so far as the Zondo Commission's suspect list and their recommendations for criminal prosecutions. You will find many of those individuals, taking you back to the days of Bosasa, who have been recommended to face criminal prosecution who are sitting in the ANC's top 8, who are sitting in the ANC's NEC, who are sitting in cabinet. Where's Willem Kize now? Under investigation by the Hawks for digital vibes. He's in the National Council of Provinces earning a salary. So it's patent at this point.
Gwede Mantashe named in the Zondo Commission.
Gwede Mantashe, same story. Lucky Montana, it continues, and the ANC recycles these people, and it has to lead us to the conclusion that the ANC is unwilling to cleanse its ranks. And that's a real betrayal of what Cyril Ramaphosa campaigned on, because he campaigned in 2017 on the cleanup ticket, that it was going to restore the ANC to its former luster of a liberation movement and an honest government that serves the people. That's not so. We've not seen it. We've seen an extremely slow pace in prosecutions, and the distinct feature lacking from our discourse is accountability for the politicians who enabled all of this. So we have a ways to go. And, I'm the worst person to have it, Brian. I'm talking now, corruption's everywhere, it's terrible. I'm just giving you an assessment of what I see and what my team does. There's 5 of us. We all have different focus areas, but the common trope that unites us all is corruption. And our mandate is to aggressively expose and thereby combat maladministration and state misspending. That's what we try to do. So it's disconcerting for us because this is the muck that I must wade through every day. It's corruptions and assassinations. It's unpleasant, but it's important. And it's important because we have to keep drawing attention back to the fact that the South African citizen deserves better, deserves to have an accountable and transparent government that does not recycle those who have maladministered, misspent, and enabled corruption in the past. It cannot be so. And we see the ANC approaching a Rubicon moment. We've got elections coming up next year. It took an absolute smashing in the last elections. And like I said earlier, this is potentially a political inflection point. Now, politics is not really my speed, but, in terms of, the national path, I think we're going to see some pretty significant changes in the near future because people are starting to develop an awareness that we deserve better.
So can I touch on the Zondo Commission for a second? Because more than 200 people get named in the Zondo Commission, 42 of them relatively senior ANC officials. And we said until a week or two ago that none of them are brought to justice. And then suddenly Malusi Kikapa gets arrested out of the blue. And it reminds me a little of, have you ever read the book Once Upon a Time in Russia? About the rise of the oligarchs, and in the beginning of the book, a bomb goes off under a relatively minor oligarch's car, not to kill him, but to indicate that he has lost his protection. And when I saw the one single ANC person suddenly being arrested, you have to ask the question, what has he done that suddenly someone is allowed to arrest him where they couldn't arrest him for the last few years since the Zondo Commission? Do you have any thoughts on Malusi Kikapa's arrest?
I think it's long overdue. He was, by all intents and purposes, the significant state capture actor, as named in the report. But I think, Howard, the issue goes deeper, and we must understand why it's taking so long. So the Investigating Directorate Against Corruption, its primary goal and function is to prosecute state capture cases. How can they be fully equipped when it took the president 4 years to make their establishment permanent? We now know from Shamila Batoy's testimony in Parliament this week that they still don't have unfettered access to the evidentiary database generated by the Zondo Commission. That is the exact narrative that I wrote about 1 year ago. Nothing has changed. And you ask why? IDAC and the NPA are institutions that were riven by state capture and denuded of nearly all their capability. And that was the damage of the state capture years. So now the rebuilding becomes the issue. And, it requires political will to rebuild. And in essence, you're asking the ANC to turn on itself. You're asking it to resource an organization that is going to come for it and come for its senior leaders. So then it makes you understand, well, perhaps that's why it took so long to make IDAC permanent. That's why its budget is still tightly constricted. That's why it still doesn't have access to the Zondo Commission archives. Now, when we talk about political will, we have the situation where you've got people like not only Gigaba, but other names include like Nosiviwe Mapisa Ngakula, the former speaker, people who've been brought before court. But I think the discontentment from South Africans comes in the time frame. It takes so long. And that's because these arms of the state, once robust, are so threadbare that it's very difficult to get things done and to get things moving. But if I take anything from, telling Babita's story, telling the stories that we do on a daily basis, is that there are still good people in the system. And they operate in a broken system. And that goes from your street cop to your prosecutors who risk their lives to do the right thing, knowing that they cannot trust their colleagues, they're under-resourced, and they're essentially left out in the cold. Good South Africans remain. Those are the people we need to protect.
Benji, the last question or two goes to you, and then we're going to ask Jeff some of the questions that have come in from the audience.
Jeff, just I wanted to just for the audience, just if you could say what RDAC is, just so that everyone can know what that.
Sure, it's the Investigating Directorate Against Corruption, a rather wordy name, but basically a subdivision of the National Prosecuting Authority, which really closely emulates the Scorpions model, so the Troika model, taking analysts, prosecutors, and policemen, putting them together and having a prosecutor lead and guide an investigation. It was very successful with the Scorpions, and IDAC is now trying to replicate that, obviously with much less resources.
Okay, thanks for that. This week you mentioned Shamila Batoy gave some evidence, and she's quoted as saying she feels powerless watching the criminals take over SA. So firstly, what's your view on her? And I'd like you to answer, if you can. We hear this quite often. We hear that South Africa was a corrupt state and it's moving to a criminal state. And maybe how you understand the difference between the two. If you could answer those two questions for me.
So when we talk about Shamila Batoy, and I must say I'm no torchbearer for the NPA or Shamila Batoy, she must account for the lack of successes of the NPA. But I think we would also be doing an immense disservice to ourselves, not understanding the architecture and the laws which underpin the operation of the NPA. And what many people don't realize is that she's almost in a figurehead position. The way the legislation is structured gives immense powers to the provincial heads of prosecution. And by law, she actually cannot interfere and meddle and help drive investigations in terms of where she sits. So she's almost handcuffed in the way the system is designed. And that explains a situation like Andrew Chauke. Now, Andrew Chauke was the head of the prosecuting authority in South Gauteng. He was also, implicated during the state capture period. And Shamila Batoy had intended to suspend him, but she can't suspend him. Only the president can. And she made representations to the president calling for his suspension. It took our president 2 years to find his pen and sign that suspension. So that should give you a small window into what they are up against at the NPA. And also understand that, state capture didn't end when the Guptas fled. All of the individuals who they'd placed in key positions remained at SARS, at the police, and at the NPA. So you've got Shamila Batoy who comes in as the new broom to sweep clean, but she's just a broom handle because the head of the broom is the state capture broom. And the first step you have to do is not only try right a sinking ship, but you've got to get rid of the people who are punching holes in the hull. And it's extremely difficult. That said, she must marshal that organization to bring about real change for South Africans. If she hasn't, we need someone new. We need someone who's willing to go and then brawl, because it is a brawl. That's what we see. This is a fight. This is a fight, and the game is high stakes. And then when it comes to our status as a criminal state or a lawless country, or our backslide towards a mafia state, I don't think we're there yet. I think there's a thin line holding us back. And it's the same line that held us back during COVID. It's the same line that held us back during the Zondo Commission. And prior to that, it's the wonderful thing about South Africans is you're very hard to beat. And so,
resilient bunch.
Yeah, exactly right. And I do feel we're at an inflection point, but we can't underestimate the danger of what we face.
What do you think? How much do you think's been stolen? What do you like in the corridors of your work of News 24? What's the guess?
It's nigh impossible to attach a figure to that, Benji, but let me rather put it this way. We talk about the investigations our team has done this year. 5 individuals, right? With 5 pretty distinct projects. So the 9 Lives project into Cat Matlalis or the cancellation of the tender, there's half a billion rand taxpayer saving. My colleague Sikunati Manchansha wrote about the government pension administration fund, an arm of the state I didn't know existed, but was trying to rent a building for R1 billion that the people they were renting it from didn't own. When he started writing about that, that contract was cancelled. There's R1 billion saving. City power, again, we've written about rampant misspending, and the Hawks are investigating. Hopefully, funds will be reclaimed. That's just my office and our team. And that's what we know about. And those are your big ticket corruption items. And that's what the shadow state is. It's this extraction at every single level. It's paying 3,000 rand for a pair of shoes when they're worth 35 rand. It's this perversion of the way we procure our goods and services to pull cash out of the state. And that stat Howard mentioned earlier about something Davi Roth said about how much money is lost to corruption. You frame it like this: how beautiful would our country be, and how wonderful all the services we'd all receive if every tax rand reached its final destination. That's what Babita Deokaran Had died for,
Yeah,
Pravin Gordon said that during the Gupta era, 1.5 trillion rand had been stolen from South Africa. And I think over a similar period, the Ramaphosa era has proved to be even worse and even more corrupt than the Gupta era.
Jeff, for our viewers who have had the immense privilege of listening to you, and you've been absolutely wonderful. Tell us, if they had to say, Jeff Wicks said this will show that all these investigations, all this effort, Babita's life, paint a picture in 2 years' time or 3 years' time or 1 year's time. What does the high road look like for us? What should be the white flags that we look for, that we know some of the effort and the energy of these things and some of the heroes have put their lives to stake? What would that look like?
You, Mr. Career in Journalism, Benji, you're quite good at asking, seeking questions. Difficult to answer. I'm going to keep my...
But it have to be radio, that we know.
Yeah, same. I'm going to have to keep my ambitions tempered, and I'm going to ring fence my expectations of the Madlanga Commission. So what I hope happens, the Madlanga Commission finishes only slightly over schedule. And what they do is they redraw the organizational structure and the political, paths of influence within our police. They map it and then they dismantle it. We have to have a return to capability of our law enforcement. That is the beginning of everything. Because if you solve the crime problem, you concomitantly solve the investment problem, which then knocks on to the employment issue. Many social ills will be addressed by fixing the criminal justice cluster. And it's a huge ask. Don't get me wrong, it's a massive ask. Is it going to happen in 2 years? Probably not. I would hope it does. But if the Madlanga Commission can do its work and be effective, and if there's political will to take its recommendations and implement them, then we're no longer on a hiding to nothing. And the first thing that they must do is raise the bar for our National Police Commissioner. Because I called Fanny Masemola amoebic earlier. I think that's being gracious. That man is nowhere. And the reality is, it's because he's allowed to be nowhere. Would it shock you to understand that the only criteria to be appointed as National Police Commissioner is having a matric certificate and not having a criminal record? That's the bar we set for the people who lead this organization. And we wonder why it doesn't work.
So, Jeff, sorry, Benji.
One last. Jeff, are you ever scared?
All the time. It's been a difficult road to walk the past couple of years. I've questioned my resolve on many occasions. And I mean, we're realistic about what we do. We're realistic about the people that we expose. And like I framed it this way in a story the other day, and I said if the state's case against someone like Vusi Muzi Matlala proves true, that he is in fact this killer, this contract killer who's eliminated people, we've taken him on with a pen. And in many ways, it speaks to the wondrous nature of journalism, because we can hold people account, and we believe that sunlight is the best disinfectant. Certainly, I do, and it's given me a lot of cover in the work that I do. But it's not been easy, and it has sometimes been scary. But we forge on, because truly, it's more important, and it's bigger than one person, bigger than any individual.
So Benji, I loved the comment to your high road. Paul Bloomberg said the high road is full of huge potholes. A very South African answer. Jeff, I'm going to ask you to do the impossible for a journalist. I'm going to pose lots of very short questions to you, and let's try keep some very short answers, and let's try get you to bed at a reasonable time. But while we do that, there's still just thousands of people watching us across the various platforms, and I'm just going to ask people to leave a note for you, a note of thanks, because I think we've seen courage and heroism tonight, and bravery, that if we had more of in South Africa would just be a much better place. So I want to thank you on behalf of everyone watching this evening, just for the unbelievable job you've done in exposing some of this corruption and leading a pathway to hopefully a better South Africa. But I want those people watching to be able to have their own words to say to you as well. And as we pose through the last few questions, if you don't mind leaving a comment for Jeff, I'd be very, very grateful.
Look forward to.
And questions that have come in. Bev says you're an inspiration and a hero, and Claire says your book has been so eye-opening. Nadine says unbelievable. Francis Anthony wants to know what happened to Hermione Cronje and why.
Hermione Cronje was the first head of, it was then the investigating director when it was still a temporary structure. And she bowed out several years ago, and she went to work for an NGO. And, she was on the receiving end of a lot of criticism for then what was the slow pace of prosecutions. And that's my short answer.
Claire wants to know, the NPA seems to be useless. Is there a role of private prosecutions that could be used?
Absolutely. The legislation exists for it, but it's an uncomfortable compromise. We should rather advance the reformation of the NPA into a functional body.
Hilton wants to know, Dr. Shaunam Kize, has she been named in the commission?
Not yet.
Not yet. Does that mean you're expecting her to be named?
No comment.
Corinne wants to know about the Department of Education. Have you started scratching there to expose some of the criminal activities within the Department of Education? We obviously saw during the area of COVID a lot that went awry in that department. Are you looking at the Department of Education?
We're digging.
Okay. Michael Kaplan says we cannot begin to kneecap South African corruption until some serious big names get convicted. Do you think that's on the cards?
Agree.
Brenda says, brilliant journalist. Wicks is a true patriot. What do you choose to investigate next? Asked Brenda.
We actually working. So I'm still investigating Cat Matlala. That will continue. There's more to that story. And then with my colleague, we're actually looking at the assassination of another whistleblower, an auditor from Ekurhuleni named Mpoma Fole. It's available on News 24 under the banner Hunted. Very similar to Babita, filed a report several days later, was assassinated. And again, linked to state procurement and possible malfeasance there.
And
Kim asked, have you got anything to say about Paul O'Sullivan?
No.
Jeff, Paul O'Sullivan has some things to say about you.
What does he have to say?
I don't know. I just read some of it along the way. I just the time is 9:30, and you've been so generous with your time. I just wanted to to once again, I don't know if I'm sharing the right thing over there. That's the book. Jeff, tell us once again, where can we get that book from? Um, Tell us where people can buy it, listen to it, read it digitally. We want everyone who's watching this evening to go out and buy a copy of this book if you haven't already read it. People say it's a depressing view of the country, but let's face it, unless we know the truth, we can't go forward. Tell us about the book briefly. How much? Where can we get it? How can people get their hands on a copy?
So the book is available on Audible and Kindle, also available for purchase at stores like Bargain Books, and exclusive books for 370 Rand. Take A Lot has stock at 100 Rand discount and delivery directly to your door. And also, Howard, just a note of thanks from my side. I'm humbled for all the kind words, and truly I'm no hero. The people who need their flowers are those who trust us with their information and allow us to tell their stories, our sources, and the people who fund us. I'm grateful for being given the platform, and thank you for all of the support and for being willing to consume the story, as depressing as it may be.
So, Jeff, if you ever want to feel appreciated for the work that you do, just go and read the comment section that has been posted on Zoom, and you'll understand just how important your work is to every South African in this country. You've given us an hour and a half, in fact, an hour and 45 minutes of your time. It has been such an honor and a privilege to be able to listen to these stories, and more importantly, to demand justice on behalf of the people of South Africa. Thank you so much for joining this evening, and I leave the final word, a blessing, to Benji.
South Africa has always been blessed by its people and cursed by its leadership. And Jeff, when we see you, we can see that in bucket loads. In our scriptures, we say, justice, justice you shall pursue. And that's what we want. And that's what someone like you does. And our democracy only exists because of people like you. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you to all the viewers. It's been a real honor. Thank you.
Humbled. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Good night. We'll see you again soon. Jeff, thanks so much for your time. So appreciate it. Cheers.
It's just such a treat to witness what goes on in our community and feel so proud and humbled. It's just a beautiful evening and we love it.
Fantastic. Tonight is dedicated to all those people who want to make Mzansi strong.